imagine Canada, the place we all think of. Politeness, maple syrup, maybe saying sorry a bit too much. But beneath that surface, there's something else going on. Something, well, a lot less sweet. Canada's own intelligence agency, CSIS, just dropped what you could only call a bombshell for the first time, really. They're saying a small, but yeah, dangerous group of Khalistani extremists are right here, using Canadian soil, using it to promote, to fund, even plan violence aimed at India. This isn't some spy thriller plot. It's happening now, right on our doorstep. It kind of changes things, doesn't it? So today, we're diving deep into this truth Canada's only just really owned up to. Our mission: cut through the fog, give you the key insights, those aha moments on this really important issue.
Bombshell is definitely the right word. This CSIS admission, it came out June 18th, 2025.
Mm-hmm.
It's a landmark. India's been raising concerns for years, decades really, saying Canada's become a bit of a safe haven. In this report, it's Canada saying, okay, yes, it confirms it's become a hub for what they call Canada-based Khalistani Extremists, CBKEs. But, and this is so important, we need to be crystal clear, we're talking about a small group. Their actions absolutely do not reflect on the vast majority of Sikhs in Canada. They're law-abiding citizens, part of Canadian society. That distinction is crucial.
Okay, wait, so let's unpack that. For listeners maybe not fully up to speed, what is the Khalistan movement about today, especially these groups operating outside India? Has it changed much from its roots?
Well, at its core, it's a separatist movement. The goal is an independent Sikh state, Khalistan, mainly carved out of India's Punjab region. It's about redrawing the map, but not peacefully. The ideology involves violence, propaganda, and there's history here, heavy history. It peaked back in the 1980s, a really bloody insurgency in Punjab, left deep scars. Thousands died, and that connects directly to something horrific: the Air India Flight 182 bombing in 1985, a Boeing 747, blown up midair, left from Vancouver heading to India. 329 people killed, 280 of them Canadians. It's still Canada's deadliest terrorist attack. Groups like Babar Khalsa, the International Sikh Youth Federation, they were implicated. Now, the movement largely fizzled out in India. Counterinsurgency efforts were pretty effective. But, and this is the troubling part, a small radicalized faction, particularly in Canada, kept that flame alive. Not through peaceful means, but actively planning violence.
And that timing. Taking until 2025 for CSIS to officially use the word extremism about these groups, that feels significant. Why the long wait? What does that tell us about maybe, I don't know, past policies or how Canada viewed this issue? It does feel like better late than never, eh?
That's a really good question. Historically, Canada's been, well, cautious, maybe very cautious about labeling groups, especially when it involves diaspora communities, freedom of speech concerns. Canada values its multiculturalism, its openness, and rightly so. But that sometimes meant activity seen as, let's say, foreign political expression got a lot of leeway. Even when it edged into extremism, it made it harder for agencies like CSIS to use their full counterterror toolkit. This new report, though, it signals a shift, a recognition that this isn't just political dissent anymore. It's a national security threat, needs a stronger response. So the insight isn't just Canada admitting we have a problem. It changes the whole diplomatic game with India. Canada's now acknowledging a shared responsibility. That's big.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting then. Canada, known for diplomacy, diversity. Why here? Why did Canada become this, I guess, unexpected hub for these extremist elements? Surely not just for the poutine.
No, probably not just the poutine. It's a mix of things. First, Canada has a huge Sikh diaspora, over 770,000 people, according to the 2021 census. Again, overwhelmingly peaceful, integrated, but a tiny fraction, really tiny, got radicalized. And they've skillfully used Canada's strong free speech laws, its multicultural ethos, things that are Canadian strengths. Plus, historically, maybe a less intense focus on monitoring certain extremist groups if they weren't seen as a direct domestic threat. This created space for what CSIS calls politically motivated violent extremism, or PMVE, to take root. That term, PMVE, it's important. It lets CSIS use specific counter-terror laws and tools. Things maybe weren't available if it was just seen as foreign politics. So since the mid-'80s, these CBKEs have used Canada, raising money, spreading propaganda, planning attacks in India. It's almost like, a sinister Kickstarter campaign for violence, a deeply disturbing one.
And they haven't exactly been hiding in the shadows, have they? We've seen pretty overt actions, targeting Indian diplomatic missions, harassing officials, even planning protests to disrupt big events. I remember specifically Prime Minister Modi's visit for the G7. Kananaski's Alberta, June 17th, 2025, Indian intelligence actually issued warnings to Canada about potential threats during that visit. And you saw the images, right? Khalistan flags, anti-India chants, right there in Calgary during a major summit. It shows how brazen they've become, how comfortable operating here.
Exactly. Those public displays really highlight the challenge. And it's not just protests. The CSIS report talks about their ongoing efforts, building global networks, fundraising, using social media to recruit, spread ideology, coordinate from Canada. It's a tough balancing act for law enforcement. Where does free expression end and inciting violence begin? The core issue, really, is that Canada's open society, its strength, has also become a vulnerability these groups are pretty adept at exploiting.
So pull back the lens a bit. What does this all mean for the India-Canada relationship, it feels like? Like a couple constantly arguing but still having to show up for family dinners, you know? The diplomatic ties have been seriously strained.
Oh, massively strained. It really hit rock bottom in 2023. Remember Prime Minister Trudeau back then? He stood up and made that bombshell statement. Credible allegations linking the Indian government to the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Nijjar, a big figure in the pro-Khalistan movement, someone India had labeled a terrorist, he was shot dead outside of Gurdwara, Surrey, BC, June 18th, 2023. Exactly 2 years before the CSIS report dropped. That sent shockwaves everywhere. Diplomatically, yes, but also within the Sikh community here and in India.
And India's reaction was immediate and fierce, called the claims absurd, motivated. The fallout was fast. India pulled diplomats, Canada expelled an Indian official, trade talks frozen, visa services halted. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a full-on geopolitical breakup. Public accusations, slammed doors, the works.
And it raises questions about the intelligence itself, how it's framed. The CSIS report we're discussing. It adds a layer to the Nijjar killing. It connects his death to, quote, criminal networks and Indian interference. Calls it a significant escalation by India against the Khalistan movement. But, crucially, India still denies any state role. And without public proof, it's still very much a he said, she said situation. Lots of mistrust there. Now, fast forward. Despite that deep freeze, something shifted recently. We saw the handshake. Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, meeting Prime Minister Modi at the G7 in Kananaskis, June 17th, 2025. And they agreed. Restore high commissioners. Restart those trade talks. A thaw, maybe.
But the timing, this is what gets me. The CSIS report we're dissecting today, released one day after that G7 meeting, June 18th, 2025. It's like Canada put out a hand, said, let's talk, and then immediately followed up with, okay, we admit there's this big problem you've been talking about, but don't get too comfy. And you can just imagine India thinking, finally. Took you long enough. This timing changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it?
It really does, the insight here. By officially acknowledging the CBKE threat, Canada might actually gain leverage. It lets them say, okay, we're addressing this. Now let's talk reciprocity on other issues, like maybe cooperating more fully on the Nijjar investigation from their end. It also helps Canada internally. Prevent a united front on security, move past that perception of denial. And for India, well, it's huge validation, even though it's late. It could potentially pave the way for better intelligence sharing, real cooperation, if that trust can be rebuilt. It shifts the conversation from, is there a problem, to, okay, how do we fix this together?
Let's widen the scope for a second, because the CSIS report wasn't just about Khalistan. It painted a much broader, frankly, quite worrying picture. It named other countries too, right? China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, all accused of meddling in Canada, trying to influence elections, policies. It almost sounded like Canada's democracy was being treated like a free-for-all buffet for foreign interference.
Yeah.
What kind of things did it mention?
Yeah, it's a stark warning about Canada's overall vulnerability. Beyond Khalistan and, say, Pakistan trying to back certain candidates, it detailed Chinese operations targeting politicians, diaspora groups, trying to sway policy, silence critics, even interfere in elections. Pretty systematic stuff. It talked about Russian disinformation campaigns, using state media, cyber attacks, trying to sow distrust in Canadian institutions, and Iran. Efforts to monitor, even intimidate Iranian Canadians here, extending Tehran's reach right onto Canadian soil. So no, it's not just one issue. It's a multi-pronged assault, really, by various state actors trying to undermine Canadian democracy and interests.
That sounds pervasive. So given all that, what's the overall risk assessment from CSIS, even if we haven't seen, say, a CBKE attack in Canada recently, like in 2024? How does this affect Canada's standing, its security?
Right, the risk goes way beyond just bombs on Canadian soil, even though there weren't CBKE attacks in Canada in 2024. The fact that these groups are actively planning violence in India from here, that's a huge risk to Canada's reputation. Imagine a major attack in India is traced back to planning done in Canada.
That would severely damage Canada's image globally as a safe, secure, responsible country. It hits diplomacy, trade, everything. How well can Canada manage its own internal security? That's the question it raises. The report also talks about this vicious cycle of mistrust, where real and perceived Khalistani extremism fuels Indian interference in Canada, which then just ramps up tensions further. It feeds itself. So the call is for sustained vigilance against the domestic extremists, yes, but also against that foreign state interference. They're tangled together.
And we absolutely have to circle back to the human cost. This isn't just about reports and diplomacy. There are real wounds here. The Air India bombing, the insurgency in Punjab. That trauma is real. It lingers. How do the actions of this small extremist group today risk stirring up old tensions? Between Sikhs and other Indians, maybe? Both back in India and right here in Canada's diaspora. That must affect community relations here.
Absolutely. That trauma from the 80s, it's not ancient history for many people. It's very present. So when a small group keeps pushing that violent narrative, it risks unfairly painting the entire Sikh community with the same brush. Leading to suspicion, maybe discrimination against people who have nothing to do with it, people who are just Canadians going about their lives. And within the wider Indian diaspora here, yeah, it can definitely strain relations between different communities, create friction in a place like Canada, built on multiculturalism. Anything that divides communities, that erodes social cohesion, that's a serious threat. It's not abstract. It affects neighborhoods, workplaces, our sense of national identity. It makes national security way more complex than just stopping plots.
So looking ahead, where does this leave us? Canada's acknowledgement is huge, yes, but it feels like just the start of a really long, maybe difficult road. Is there hope?
Well, for Canada, it's a tightrope walk now. They need to crack down effectively on the extremist groups. Targeted intelligence, clear actions, but do it without making the wider Sikh community feel targeted or alienated. That requires incredible nuance, transparency, avoiding any hint of bias. It's tough. For India, the ball's in their court too, to some extent. Engage constructively, share intelligence properly, help track the money flowing to these groups, and maybe step back from the public tit-for-tat accusations that just escalate things. Both sides need pragmatic cooperation, not just blaming, if they want real progress.
And the politics of it all, you can't ignore that. Prime Minister Carney's government in Canada, it's not leaning on support from figures sympathetic to Khalistan, maybe like past governments were, especially with Jagmeet Singh's NDP losing ground in the 2025 election. Does that give Carney more freedom to act? Maybe be tougher? But he'll still face pressure, right? From Sikh activists focused on free speech, from civil liberties groups watching closely. Meanwhile, over in India, Modi's BJP is strong. Elections are always on the horizon. A tough-on-terror stance plays well domestically. It really does feel like both leaders are, like the outline said, juggling flaming torches on unicycles. It's incredibly precarious.
That's a pretty good image for it, yeah. The political math in both countries is key. Carney might have more room to maneuver now, politically. Less beholden, perhaps. But any action needs careful framing. It can't look like it's targeting a whole community. That's political dynamite. And Modi, yeah, domestic politics demands strength on national security, especially separatism. He can't afford to look weak. So even with this new diplomatic opening, those domestic pressures, they can easily pull things off course. It really shows how much internal politics drives foreign policy.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the CSIS report from June 18th, 2025, it's more than just paper. It feels like a real turning point. India's been raising the alarm for a long, long time. Now, Canada's officially listening and responding. Our goal here wasn't to point fingers. It was to understand. Understand how a small group can inflict so much harm and how that ripples out, affecting lives, security, and that whole complex dance of international relations. It really shows how linked global security and our local communities are.
And the key thing for you, listening, the takeaway, a few extremists don't define a whole community. Never. But ignoring them, letting them operate freely, that's just not an option for any country that values its security and its place in the world. It demands vigilance, yes, but also wisdom.
Indeed. You know, if Canada and India can agree on maple syrup and mangoes, surely they can figure out how to tackle this mess together. Maybe they need a friendly cricket match or a Tim Hortons summit for the intelligence chiefs. Who knows? But this whole situation really invites you to keep thinking about those subtle diplomatic moves, the pressures playing out behind the headlines, and how global events really do land right in our own backyards.